An October morning in Thornton greeted David Chen with the sound of his alarm clock at 6 o'clock. He carefully slipped out of bed, trying not to wake Nancy, who was sleeping peacefully next to him, wrapped in a blanket. Sunlight streamed through the blinds of their bedroom in the small house on Thunderbolt Street, illuminating the photos of their recent wedding on the bedside table. In the bathroom, David looked at himself in the mirror. 35 years old, gray hair appearing early at his temples, but his life was falling into place. His job at Mountain View Motors provided a steady income. Nancy loved him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt happy. If only it weren't for the constant tension caused by Odette. After making coffee, David sat down at the kitchen table and opened his phone. There was a message from Margaret Mitchell, Nancy's mother. Family dinner on Sunday. Be there at 6. Odette will be there too. David frowned. These family gatherings had become a minefield since he married Nancy 8 months ago. Odette, his ex-wife, had a hard time hiding her dissatisfaction. And Margaret, trying to keep the family together, only made things worse by insisting on joint meetings. "Good morning, dear," Nancy whispered, hugging him from behind. Her chestnut hair tickled his neck. At 29, she looked younger than her age, with soft features and kind hazel eyes. "Mom invited us to dinner on Sunday," David said, showing her the message. Nancy sighed. "Will Odette be there?" "Yes. Maybe this time it will be okay," Nancy said without much conviction. She poured herself some coffee and sat down across from her husband. "David, we can't avoid this forever. She's my sister." David nodded, but inside he felt a knot in his stomach. He remembered the last family dinner 3 weeks ago. Odette had been polite, even overly polite, but her eyes had told a different story. When Nancy went into the kitchen to help her mother, Odette whispered to him, "You know you're doing the wrong thing. This is going to destroy our family." At the auto repair shop, the day began as usual. David was working on a 2019 Chevrolet Silverado when his colleague Mike Rodriguez approached him with a cup of coffee. "How's it going at home?" Mike asked. He knew about David's difficult family situation and was sympathetic. "We're surviving," David replied, tightening a bolt. "Family dinner again on Sunday." "Will Odette be there?" "Of course." Mike shook his head. "Man, I still don't understand how you managed to marry your ex-wife's sister. That's like playing with fire." David stopped what he was doing. "It just happened. I didn't plan it." And it was true. After his divorce from Odette 2 years ago, David was devastated. Their marriage had lasted 5 years, but the last 2 had been a nightmare. Odette had become cold, critical, and constantly nitpicking. She worked as a nurse at Thornton City Hospital and came home exhausted, but instead of supporting her, they just fought. The divorce was painful. Odette accused him of giving up and not fighting for their relationship. David felt guilty, but he knew they were both unhappy. Then a year ago, he ran into Nancy at the King Soopers grocery store on 120th Avenue. She was buying groceries for her mother, and he was picking up frozen dinners for a single man. They struck up a conversation while waiting in line at the checkout. Nancy had always been his favorite sister-in-law. She was a teacher at Thornton Elementary School and had a warmth that Odette lacked. Their meetings began innocently: coffee, conversations about life, mutual support. Nancy was going through her own breakup, and David was recovering from his divorce. They fell in love slowly, almost without realizing it themselves. Their first kiss happened 3 months after that meeting at the store in Carpenter Park, when they were walking late at night and talking about their dreams. When they decided to get married, David insisted on talking to Odette first. It was one of the most difficult conversations of his life. They met at Grounds for Coffee on Main Street. Odette arrived in her medical uniform after her shift, looking tired. When David told her about his relationship with Nancy, her face turned to stone. "My sister?" she said quietly, but there was anger in her voice. "You're dating my younger sister?" "Odette, I know this is difficult." "Difficult?" She raised her voice, causing other patrons to look over. "David, you're destroying my family. Nancy was the only person I could trust after our divorce. We didn't plan this." "You didn't plan this? 5 months, David. 5 months you've been seeing her behind my back." Odette stood up, gathering her things. "You betrayed me twice. First as a husband, now as this." She left, leaving David alone with the guilt that had haunted him ever since. During his lunch break, David drove to Thornton Elementary to meet Nancy. It had become their tradition to have lunch together when time allowed. The school was 10 minutes away from the auto repair shop, in a quiet residential neighborhood with neat houses and well-kept lawns. Nancy came out of the school with a group of fellow teachers, laughing at someone's joke. When she saw David, her face lit up with a smile. She said goodbye to her colleagues and walked over to his truck. "How's your day been?" she asked, climbing into the passenger seat. "Fine. How about yours?" Tommy Johnson got into another fight during gym class. His parents are coming in tomorrow for a meeting. Nancy sighed. "Sometimes I feel like I'm more of a social worker than a teacher." They drove to their favorite spot, a small Mexican cafe called Maria's Kitchen on Washington Street. Over plates of tacos and guacamole chips, they talked about the upcoming family dinner. "Mom's trying really hard," Nancy said. "She wants the family to be together." "And Odette wants me gone," David replied. "Don't say that. She just needs some time." David looked at his wife. Nancy always saw the best in people, even her sister, but he knew Odette better. Over the past few months, he had noticed how she looked at them at family gatherings, how she tensed up when they showed affection for each other. It wasn't just the discomfort of a divorced woman. It was something deeper, darker. "Nancy, what if we skip this dinner?" "David." She put her hand on his. "I don't want to choose between you and your family. Please." He squeezed her hand. "Okay, we'll go." That evening, as they were preparing dinner in their small kitchen, Nancy's phone rang. The screen lit up with the name Odette. Nancy hesitated, then answered. "Hi, sis." David couldn't hear what Odette was saying, but he could see Nancy's face change. First surprise, then concern. "Odette, don't say that. I understand that this is difficult. No, we can't call off the wedding. We're already married. Please don't make Mom choose sides." The conversation went on for another 10 minutes. When Nancy hung up, she looked upset. "What did she say?" David asked. "She said we're destroying the family, that Mom can't sleep at night because of our relationship, that I betrayed her." David hugged his wife. "You haven't betrayed anyone. We have a right to be happy." "But she's my sister, David. My only sister. We've been so close all our lives." Nancy's voice was tearful. David understood her pain. The Mitchell sisters had been very close. After their father died when Nancy was 16 and Odette was 19, they had supported each other and their mother. Odette was the protector, Nancy the comforter. Now that bond was broken. Late at night, after Nancy had gone to bed, David sat in his garage workshop, taking apart a motorcycle engine. Working with his hands helped him think. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Odette was becoming increasingly hostile, rather than adjusting to the situation as he had hoped. Maybe Mike was right. Maybe marrying his ex-wife's sister was a mistake. But when he thought about Nancy, about her smile, about how she made his life better, he knew he couldn't regret it. Tomorrow would be a new day, and Sunday would bring another test in the form of a family dinner. David just hoped that they could all find a way to live in peace. But deep down, he felt that something was bound to break, and he feared that when it did, the consequences would be catastrophic. Sunday morning at the house on Thunderbolt Street began with the smell of pancakes and the sounds of cooking. Nancy stood at the stove in her pink robe, flipping pancakes while David read the news on his tablet at the kitchen table. It seemed like a normal family morning, but both of them felt the tension of the upcoming dinner at Margaret's. "David, tell me the truth about your divorce from Odette." Nancy said without turning away from the stove. David looked up from his tablet. In 8 months of marriage, Nancy had rarely asked about the details of his previous relationship with her sister. She usually limited herself to general phrases about how it didn't work out. Why do you need to know this now? After talking to her yesterday, David, she sounded like you did something terrible. Like the whole divorce was your fault. David put down his tablet. It was a conversation he had been dreading, but it was inevitable. Sit down, he said. It's a long story. Nancy turned off the stove and sat down across from him with a cup of coffee. Her face was serious, ready for whatever the truth might be. We got married too fast, David began. We met at Charlie's Pub on 84th Avenue, dated for 6 months, then got married. Odette was 26. I was 29. We thought we loved each other. He paused, remembering. The first 2 years were good. Odette had just started working at Thornton Hospital, and I was working at the same auto repair shop. We bought a small house on Huron Street and planned to have children. What changed? Odette changed. Her job at the hospital began to consume her. She started working double shifts and came home exhausted and irritable. Every conversation turned into an argument. David stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the empty Sunday street. I tried to support her. I cooked dinner, cleaned the house, offered to take time off work. But she pushed me away. She said I didn't understand the pressure of her job, that I was selfish and only thought about myself. What about the children? We tried for 2 years. Nothing worked. Odette had tests done, and so did I. The doctors said there were no medical problems, that sometimes these things happen, but it destroyed her. She became obsessed with the idea. Nancy listened silently, holding her cup with both hands. The last year of our marriage was a nightmare, David continued. Odette became cold and critical. Every day she found something to complain about. I left a dirty plate in the sink and got an hour-long lecture about how irresponsible I was. I was half an hour late from work and she suspected me of cheating. Did you cheat on her? Never. David turned to his wife. Not once in 5 years of marriage, but she didn't believe me. She checked my phone, demanded reports on every dollar I spent. Nancy frowned. This wasn't the sister she knew. Odette had always been strong-willed, but not paranoid. The last straw was your mother's birthday 2 years ago, David said. Remember that dinner? Nancy nodded. She remembered how tense David and Odette had looked that evening, how they had barely spoken to each other. Odette made a scene right at the table. She accused me of flirting with the waitress at the restaurant. The girl was maybe 19 years old. It was humiliating. I remember Mom was very upset. After that dinner, I realized I couldn't go on. We went to a family therapist, Dr. Caroline Hill on Grant Street. 3 months of sessions. Odette blamed me for all the problems, and I tried to find compromises. David sat back down at the table. At the last session, Dr. Hill told us straight out, your marriage is over. You are hurting each other, and it has to stop. Odette left the office and didn't speak to me for 3 days. Who filed for divorce? I did, but only because I realized that if I didn't, we would destroy each other. Nancy was silent for a long time, digesting what she had heard. Finally, she said, she told me a different version. What was that? That you left her when she needed you most. That you didn't support her when she was having problems at work and with her pregnancy. That you fell in love with someone else. David smiled bitterly. Someone else? Nancy, I couldn't even think about a relationship for a year after the divorce. I blamed myself for not being able to save our marriage. And then you met me. And you saved me, he said, taking her hand. You showed me what real love is. No blame, no trying to change me. Nancy squeezed his hand, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. David, what if she's right? What if our relationship really did destroy a family? Nancy, no, listen, Odette was right. We dated for 5 months without telling anyone. It wasn't fair to her. David stood up and hugged his wife. We didn't plan to fall in love. It just happened. They spent Sunday trying to prepare for the family dinner. David washed the car in the garage, trying to keep his hands busy and calm his nerves. Nancy baked an apple pie for her mother, a family recipe that she and Odette had made together since childhood. At 4 o'clock, they drove to Margaret Mitchell's house on Coronado Parkway. It was a 2-story house in an old neighborhood in Thornton, where the sisters had grown up after moving from Denver when their father got a job at a local hospital. After his death 15 years ago, Margaret was left alone in a house that was too big for her, but she refused to move. Odette's car, a blue Honda Civic, was already parked in the driveway. "She's here early," Nancy remarked, her voice tinged with anxiety. "Everything will be fine," David said, but he didn't believe it himself. Margaret opened the door with a forced smile. At 58, she was still an attractive woman, but the last few months had added gray hair and wrinkles. The family conflict had aged her. "David, Nancy, come in. Odette is already here, helping in the kitchen." The living room smelled of roast chicken and homemade bread. Family photos on the mantelpiece showed happier times. Odette and Nancy as children, their father with the girls on a fishing trip, their first days at school. One photo showed David and Odette's wedding, young, smiling, full of hope. Odette came out of the kitchen with a tray of appetizers. She was a year older than Nancy, but she looked older than her 32 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a strict ponytail. She wore no makeup, and her blue eyes looked tired. The medical work and stress of recent years had left their mark. "Hi," she said in a neutral tone, placing the tray on the coffee table. "Hi, Odette," David replied. "How's work?" "Fine." A short answer, avoiding eye contact. Nancy handed her a slice of pie. "I made apple, your favorite." Odette took the pie, and her face softened for a moment. "Thanks. Do you remember how we used to make it with Mom on Thanksgiving?" "Of course I do. You always insisted on adding extra cinnamon." It was a moment of sisterly closeness, but it passed quickly. Odette became cold and distant again. At dinner, Margaret desperately tried to keep the conversation going. She talked about new books at the library, asked Nancy about her students, and inquired about David's work. Odette responded in monosyllables when spoken to, and remained silent most of the time. "Odette, you look tired," Margaret said. "Maybe you should take some time off." "I can't. Too much work." "There's always a lot of work at the hospital," David said gently. "But rest is important." Odette looked up at him. "Thanks for the advice, but I'll manage." The coldness in her voice was palpable. "Odette, please," Nancy interjected. "We're all worried about you." "Worried?" Odette put down her fork. "Really? When you were secretly meeting behind my back?" A heavy silence fell. Margaret looked as if she wanted to hide under the table. "Odette," Nancy began, "we didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did." Odette stood up from the table. "You were my sister, Nancy, the only person I trusted, and you stole my husband." "Ex-husband," David corrected quietly. "Shut up!" Odette snapped. "You have no right to speak in this house. You destroyed this family." "Odette, stop," Margaret said, but her voice was trembling. "No, Mom, it's time to tell the truth. He used me, and when he got tired of me, he moved on to my sister. And she, my own sister, let him do it." Nancy turned pale. "That's not true." "Not true? You were seeing him while we were still married?" "We were divorced 6 months before I met David at the store," Nancy exclaimed. Odette laughed bitterly. "At the store? What a touching story. What about the time he accidentally stopped by your house when you had a cold?" "That was only 3 months after our divorce." David and Nancy exchanged glances. David had indeed brought Nancy medicine when she had the flu, but there was nothing between them then. "Odette, we were just friends back then," David said. "Friends?" Odette moved closer to the table. "David, do you think I'm blind? I saw the way you looked at her even when we were still married. At family dinners, at holidays. You always paid more attention to her than to me. That's not true. It is, Odette shouted. And you know what hurts the most? Nancy knew. She saw the way you looked at her and she liked it. Odette, stop, Nancy said with tears in her eyes. I never what? Never flirted with my husband? Never fantasized about what it would be like to be with me? Margaret stood up from the table. Enough, Odette, you're going too far. Too far? Odette turned to her mother. Mom, they stole my life, my husband, my family, my place in this house. Nobody stole anything, Margaret said. You and David are divorced. People move on. Move on? Odette laughed hysterically. With my sister? That's not moving on, that's betrayal. David stood up. Odette, I understand that you're hurt, but you don't understand anything. She turned to him. You think you can just switch from one sister to another like you switch cars? You think that's okay? We love each other, David said. Love? Odette moved closer. David, did you tell Nancy about our attempts to reconcile? Everyone fell silent. Nancy looked at her husband in surprise. What attempts? She asked. Odette smiled a cold smile. Oh, he didn't tell you? How interesting. Odette, don't, David warned. But it was too late. A month after the divorce, David came to see me. He was crying, saying he had made a mistake. He asked me to give our marriage another chance. Nancy turned even paler. Is that true? David closed his eyes. Nancy. Is that true? She repeated. Yes, but... And what did you say? Nancy looked at her sister. Odette relished the moment. I told him to think about it. I gave him 2 weeks. Do you know what he did those 2 weeks, Nancy? He was seeing you. The silence was deafening. Margaret clung to the back of her chair. Nancy looked at David with pain in her eyes, and Odette gloated. Nancy, it's not what you think, David began. Not what I think? Nancy stood up. You were seeing me while she was waiting for your answer about getting back together? I already knew I wasn't going back to her. I just couldn't tell her right away. Because you were already in love with me, Nancy finished. My God, David. She headed for the door. David followed her. Nancy, wait, Odette shouted after them. That's what happens when you build a relationship on lies. They were silent in the car on the way home. Nancy stared out the window. David gripped the steering wheel. Finally, she spoke. You should have told me. I know. I married you thinking I knew the whole truth about your divorce. Nancy, I didn't lie to you. I just didn't tell you about one episode that meant nothing. Meant nothing? She turned to him. It meant everything to Odette. She thought you had a chance. There was no chance, our marriage was dead. But she didn't know that. At home, they continued to argue. Nancy felt betrayed, and David tried to explain that his feelings for Odette had died long ago, but the damage was done. Late that night, after Nancy had gone to bed, David received a message from Odette. The truth hurts, doesn't it? But this is only the beginning. He deleted the message without replying, but the feeling of unease lingered. Odette clearly had no intention of giving up, and now she had found a way to sow doubt between him and Nancy. Monday morning brought a cold atmosphere of unspoken tension to the house on Thunderbolt Street. David woke up alone. Nancy had already left for work without waking him or leaving her usual note. There was no coffee in the kitchen, which was the first warning sign. In 8 months of marriage, Nancy had never left without kissing him goodbye. There was a note on the table. I need time to think. Please give me some space today. David clenched the note in his fist. Last night had been spent in painful silence. Nancy had gone to sleep in the guest room, saying she needed to be alone. He didn't sleep until 3 in the morning, listening to the sounds coming from the next room, where his wife was quietly crying. David worked as a mechanic at Mountain View Motors, his thoughts constantly returning to the family drama. Mike Rodriguez noticed his state before lunchtime. "Man, you look like you've been hit by a truck," Mike said, approaching David, who was working under the hood of a Ford F-150. "Family dinner didn't go so well last night," David replied without looking up. "Odette made a scene again?" "Worse. She told Nancy that I came to see her after the divorce." Mike whistled. "Damn. You didn't tell your wife about that?" "I didn't see the point. It didn't mean anything. Maybe not to you, but it always means a lot to women." Mike shook his head. "David, you should have told her from the start. It's too late now." During his lunch break, David tried to call Nancy, but she didn't answer. He sent her a text message. "Can we talk? I'll explain everything." There was no reply. The day at Thornton Elementary School was also difficult. Nancy tried to concentrate on her lessons, but her thoughts kept returning to yesterday's revelation. The children noticed her distraction. "Mrs. Chen, are you okay?" asked 8-year-old Emma Johnson during math class. "Everything's fine, dear. Let's continue with the problems." But everything was not fine. Nancy felt betrayed not only by her husband, but also by herself. How could she not have noticed that David was hiding such an important detail? What else was he hiding from her? During lunch break, she sat in the teacher's lounge, staring at the unread messages from David. Her colleague, Susan Parker, a 4th-grade teacher, sat down next to her with a cup of coffee. "Nancy, you look upset. Want to talk about it?" Nancy hesitated. Susan was a good friend, but family problems seemed too personal to discuss. "Things are tough at home," she said finally. "With David?" Nancy nodded. "You know, marriage is a complicated thing," Susan said gently. "Especially when there's family history." Nancy looked at her in surprise. "You know? Thornton's not a big town. People talk." Susan shrugged. "But that doesn't mean they're right to judge you." "What are people saying?" Susan hesitated. "That it's an unusual situation. Marrying your ex-wife's sister. Unusual," Nancy repeated bitterly. "That's what they call it. Nancy, if you love David, don't let others ruin your relationship, even if that other person is your sister." But Susan's words offered no comfort. The doubts Odette had planted were growing like weeds. Meanwhile, at Thornton Hospital, Odette Mitchell was finishing her day shift in the intensive care unit. It had been a busy day. 3 patients in critical condition, 1 case of cardiac arrest, and a family demanding constant updates on the condition of their loved one. But despite the professional stress, Odette felt satisfied with the previous evening. She had finally told the truth. Nancy had finally seen her husband for who he really was. In the locker room, she was changing into her street clothes when her colleague, Dr. Lisa Williams, approached her. "Odette, you seem strange today," Lisa said, either happy or vengeful. "Just a good day," Odette replied, buttoning her jacket. "Is it about your sister and your ex-husband?" Odette stopped. "You know about that?" "The medical community in Thornton is small. Plus, remember, I was at your wedding." Lisa sat down on a bench. "Odette, I understand that you're hurting, but what? Maybe it's time to let go? You're destroying yourself with this anger." Odette turned sharply toward her colleague. "Let go? Lisa, they betrayed me, my husband and my sister. How can I let go?" "Ex-husband," Lisa corrected gently. "Odette, you've been divorced for 2 years. We divorced because he wanted to be with her. You said yourself that your marriage had been unhappy for years." Odette fell silent. It was a truth she preferred not to remember. Her marriage to David had indeed been falling apart long before the divorce, but admitting that meant accepting some of the responsibility for what had happened. "That doesn't excuse their behavior," she said finally. "Maybe not, but by destroying their relationship, you're destroying your family." Odette didn't answer, but Lisa's words hit a nerve. Family. Yes, she loved Nancy. She had loved her all her life, protected her, been her big sister and her best friend. But now, Nancy had chosen David. That evening, Odette sat in her apartment on Washington Street. a small one-room place she had rented after her divorce. Unlike the cozy house she had shared with David, this place felt temporary, faceless. The walls were decorated with only a few family photos and her nursing diploma. She looked at a childhood photo of herself and Nancy on a swing in the park, both laughing and hugging each other. Nancy was 6, Odette was 9. Back then, she had sworn to always protect her younger sister. The phone rang. It was her mother. "Odette, dear, I need to talk to you." "Hi, Mom." "After yesterday, Odette, what's going on? Why did you treat Nancy so cruelly?" "Cruelly?" Odette stood up and began pacing the room. "Mom, I told the truth. You humiliated her in front of her husband. You humiliated both of them. They deserved it. No one deserves to be treated that way in my house." Margaret's voice grew stern. "Odette, I am your mother, and I love you. But what you did yesterday was wrong." "Wrong? What about what they did to me?" "They fell in love. That's not a crime." "During my marriage." "After your divorce," Margaret corrected. "Odette, dear, you know that your marriage to David was over long before the divorce was finalized. You told me so yourself." "Mom." "And now you're destroying your relationship with your only sister because of a man you weren't happy with anymore." Odette felt her throat tighten with tears. "Mom, you don't understand. She was everything to me, the only person I trusted, and she betrayed me. She fell in love. With my husband. With a good man who wasn't right for you anymore." A long pause. Odette wiped away her tears. "Mom, what if I can't forgive her?" "Then you'll lose your sister. And me too." "What do you mean?" "Odette, I won't let you destroy this family. If you continue down this path, if you continue to hurt Nancy and David, I will be forced to choose sides. And you'll choose her side. I will choose the side of peace and love. Think about it, dear." Margaret hung up, leaving Odette alone with her thoughts and her pain. At the same time, David finally waited for Nancy to come home. She arrived late, around 9 o'clock, her eyes red from crying. "I need to know the truth," she said, without even saying hello. "The whole truth about your divorce." David turned off the TV and turned to his wife. "Sit down. I'll tell you everything." For the next 2 hours, he told her about the last months of his marriage to Odette, about how she had become cold and suspicious, about the constant arguments, about the therapy that hadn't helped, about how he realized they no longer loved each other. "And when did you go to see her after the divorce?" Nancy asked. "It was a month later. I felt guilty. I thought maybe I hadn't tried hard enough to save our marriage." David took his wife's hands in his. "But when I saw her that day, I realized we were strangers, that there was no love left between us. And then you met me." "Yes. And I realized what true love was." Nancy was silent for a long time, thinking about what she had heard. "David, you should have told me about this." "I know, I'm sorry. What else are you hiding from me?" "Nothing. No more secrets." Nancy looked into his eyes, searching for signs of deception. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but if I find out you've been hiding something from me again, you won't. I promise." They made up that night, but the crack in their relationship remained. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. The next morning, Nancy received a message from Odette. "I need to talk to you, alone. It's important." Nancy showed the message to David. "Don't meet with her," he said. "She'll only hurt you. She's my sister. Maybe we can work things out." "Nancy, I have to try." They met at Grounds for Coffee on Main Street on Wednesday evening. It was the same place where David had once told Odette about his relationship with Nancy. It was symbolic and painful. Odette was already sitting at a table in the far corner when Nancy arrived. She looked tired but determined. "Thanks for coming," Odette said when Nancy sat down across from her. "What did you want to talk about?" "About us. About the family. Odette took a sip of coffee. Nancy, I miss you. Nancy felt her heart tighten. I miss you too. Then why are we letting a man destroy our relationship? Odette, this man is my husband. He was my husband for 5 years. Several patrons looked over. Odette lowered her voice. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to shout. She leaned closer. Nancy, listen to me. David is using you the way he used me. That's not true. It is. He's selfish. When he got bored with me, he found you. We love each other. He said the same thing to me. Odette took her sister's hand. Nancy, what will happen when he gets bored with you? Will he find a third sister? Nancy pulled her hand away. We don't have a third sister. But there are other women. Odette, stop. I can't stop because I love you. Odette raised her voice again. You're my little sister. I've protected you your whole life. From bullies at school, from bad guys in college. And now, I have to protect you from him. I don't need protection from my own husband. You do. And I'll prove it. Nancy stood up. I'm not going to listen to this. Nancy, wait. Odette stood up too. I'm offering you a deal. What kind of deal? Give me a month. 1 month to prove to you that David doesn't love you, that he's capable of betrayal. And if you don't prove it, then I'll back off. I won't interfere in your relationship anymore. Nancy hesitated. And if you do prove it, you'll leave him and come back to your family. Odette, this is madness. It's the only way to save you. Nancy looked at her sister. There was despair in her eyes, and something else. Something dark and frightening. I'm not making any deals, she said finally. But if you leave us alone, I'll work on repairing our relationship. And if I don't? Nancy didn't answer and left, leaving Odette alone in the cafe. That night, Odette sat in her apartment, planning her next move. The month she had given Nancy was not just a threat. It was a plan. She knew David's weaknesses. She knew how to make him slip up. And she knew that when Nancy saw her husband's true colors, she would understand who her real family was. Odette picked up the phone and dialed the number of a private investigator she had found online. If she needed to dig up dirt on David, she was ready to do it. Blackstone Agency? I need to conduct an investigation. The plan was in motion, and Odette was prepared to go as far as necessary to get her sister back. Saturday, November 2nd, 7 o'clock in the evening. Margaret Mitchell's house on Coronado Parkway was lit by warm lights, but the atmosphere inside was far from cozy. Margaret had spent the entire day preparing a family dinner, hoping that the home environment would help mend the relationship between her daughters. David and Nancy arrived first. In the 3 weeks since their meeting at the cafe, their relationship had stabilized, but a shadow of suspicion still lingered between them. Nancy knew that Odette was up to something. Strange phone calls with immediate hang-ups, an unfamiliar car she had noticed several times near the school. Mom looks exhausted, Nancy remarked, hugging Margaret at the door. This situation is killing her, David replied quietly. We can't let this go on. Margaret led them into the living room, where the table was set for 4. The best china, candles, and family photos were arranged to remind them of happier times. Odette is late, Margaret said, nervously adjusting the napkins. She promised to be here at 7. At 7:15, Odette arrived. David looked out the window and saw her sitting in her car, gathering her courage. The last 3 weeks had not been easy for her. The private investigator had found nothing compromising on David. Her work at the hospital was becoming increasingly stressful, and her isolation from her family was driving her to despair. When Odette entered the house, everyone noticed the changes in her appearance. She had lost weight, dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her hands were shaking slightly. She was carrying a large bag, which she placed by the door. Sorry I'm late, she said, avoiding eye contact with David and Nancy. It's all right, dear, Margaret replied, but there was concern in her voice. You look tired. It was a long week at the hospital. At dinner, Margaret desperately tried to keep the conversation light. The weather, the news, plans for Thanksgiving. But the tension was palpable. Odette was silent most of the time, mechanically poking at her food with her fork. "Odette, you're hardly eating anything," Nancy remarked with genuine concern. "I'm not hungry." "Maybe you're sick? You look strange." Odette looked up at her sister. "Look strange? You know what's strange, Nancy? It's strange to see your family falling apart." "Odette, please," Margaret interjected. "We're here to make peace." "Make peace?" Odette put down her fork. "Mom, some things can't be fixed." "They can if you want them to," David said. "Odette, I know you're angry with me, but Nancy doesn't deserve this." "She doesn't?" Odette stood up from the table. "What do I deserve? To be betrayed by my own sister." "You weren't betrayed," said Nancy. "We fell in love after you were divorced." "You're lying." "Odette, you're lying!" Odette shouted. "I saw the way you looked at him when we were still married. I saw the way he looked at you." David stood up. "That's not true, and you know it." "I know?" Odette turned to him. "What do I know about you, David?" "That you're a good husband, loyal, honest." "Odette, stop it," Margaret said sternly. "No, Mom, it's time to tell the whole truth." Odette went to her bag by the door. "You want to know what I've been doing for the last 3 weeks, Nancy?" "Odette, what are you doing?" Nancy asked anxiously. Odette took a folder of documents out of her bag. "I hired a private investigator. I had your precious husband followed." David turned pale. "Are you out of your mind?" "Maybe I am. From the pain, from the betrayal, from the fact that my family chose a stranger over me." "Odette, put those papers down," Margaret said, standing up. "This has gone too far." "Too far? Mom, they went too far when they decided to build their happiness on my bones." Nancy approached her sister. "Odette, please, let's talk calmly." "Calmly?" Odette stepped back. "Nancy, do you want to know what the detective found out?" "Odette, don't," David warned. "Nothing," Odette shouted. "Nothing compromising. Your husband turned out to be damn honest." Everyone fell silent, stunned by her words. "And you know what that means?" Odette continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It means that the problem was me, that I lost him not because of his faults, but because of mine." "Odette." Nancy took a step toward her sister. "Don't come near me," Odette recoiled. "Do you think it's easy for me to admit that I was a bad wife? That I pushed away the only man who loved me?" "You weren't a bad wife," David said gently. "We just weren't right for each other." "Not right? Are you right for her?" Odette pointed at Nancy. "What does she have that I didn't?" "Odette, stop," Margaret pleaded. "You're hurting yourself." "Hurting myself?" Odette laughed hysterically. "Mom, I live in pain every day. Every morning I wake up and remember that I've lost everything, my husband, my sister, my family." She took something else out of her bag. David realized with horror that it was a knife from the kitchen set, a large, sharp meat knife. "Odette, put that down," he said, slowly raising his hands. "Why? Are you afraid?" Her eyes were wild. "I've protected Nancy my whole life, from everyone who could hurt her, and now it turns out that I'm going to hurt her the most." "Odette, put the knife down," Nancy said, trying to sound calm. "We can work this out." "Work it out? How, Nancy? Are you going to divorce him for me? Go back to your family?" "I can't. Can't or won't." "Odette, I love him." Those words broke something inside Odette. Her face contorted with rage and pain. "You love him?" She raised the knife. "Have you ever loved me? Or have I always just been a hindrance in your life?" "You're my sister, of course I love you." "Then choose, him or me." "Odette, don't make me choose." "Choose." David slowly moved toward Odette, trying to stand between her and Nancy. Odette, let's talk. Just you and me. Talk? She turned to him. About what, David? About how you ruined my life? I didn't want to ruin your life. But you did. And now you want to take my sister away from me too. Margaret stood by the phone, ready to call the police, but afraid to provoke Odette. Mom, don't you dare! Odette shouted, noticing her movement. This is a family matter. Odette, dear, put down the knife. We all love you. Love me? Then why did you choose him over me? At that moment, David tried to grab Odette's knife-wielding hand. A struggle ensued. Nancy screamed and rushed to help her husband. No! Odette shouted. Don't touch him! In the chaos of the struggle, the knife stabbed twice. First in David's chest, as he tried to disarm Odette. Then, when Nancy tried to stop her sister, the blade found her heart. Silence fell suddenly. Odette stood over the bodies of her husband and sister, the knife falling from her hands. Margaret screamed, but Odette couldn't hear her. She could only see the blood on her hands and knew she had done something irreparable. Margaret dialed 911 with trembling hands. 911, what's happened? I need the police and an ambulance. My address is 1247 Coronado Parkway. My daughter, she killed her. Oh my God, she killed them both. The first police officers arrived 7 minutes later. Detective Chase Brown received the call while he was having dinner with his family. A 45-year-old veteran of the Thornton Police Department, he had seen it all, but family tragedies were always the hardest for him. At the scene, he was met with a picture of chaos. 2 bodies lay in the living room. Blood covered the carpet. An elderly woman sat in shock on the couch, and a young woman in blood-stained clothes stood by the window, staring into nothingness. Detective Brown, he introduced himself to Margaret. Can you tell me what happened? Margaret could barely speak through her tears. My daughter Odette killed her sister Nancy and her husband David. It was a family dinner. We just wanted to make up. Chase looked at Odette, who was still standing motionless. Ma'am, I'm Detective Brown. I need to talk to you. Odette slowly turned to him. Her eyes were empty, as if she were in a trance. I killed them, she said quietly. I killed the only people I ever loved. Chase nodded to his colleague, who approached with handcuffs. Odette Mitchell, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder. You have the right to remain silent. As he read her the rights, the forensic team began working at the crime scene. The knife was found next to the bodies. Signs of a struggle were evident. Overturned chairs, broken dishes. Dr. Maria Sanchez, the medical examiner, arrived half an hour later. 2 victims, she reported to Chase. A man, approximately 35 years old, 1 stab wound to the chest, heart pierced. A woman, around 30, also wounded in the heart. Both died almost instantly. Time of death? Preliminary estimate is between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Chase examined the scene. There was blood only near the bodies, indicating that the attack had taken place there. There were no signs of robbery or accidental entry. In Odette's bag, he found documents from a detective agency, reports on surveillance of David Chen. This added a motive of premeditation. Is the victim's mother in a condition to give a statement? He asked the paramedic. She's in shock, but she's conscious. She can answer questions. Chase sat down next to Margaret on the couch. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand how difficult this is, but I need to know what happened tonight. Margaret told him about the family conflict, how Odette couldn't accept her sister's marriage to her ex-husband, and the growing tension in recent months. Did she bring the knife from home? Chase asked. Yes, in her bag. She said she hired a private investigator to follow David. What happened immediately before the attack? She demanded that Nancy choose between her and her husband. When Nancy refused, Odette lost control. By midnight, the scene had been completely processed. The bodies were taken away by ambulance, and Odette was taken to the station for questioning. Margaret was picked up by a neighbor. At the station, Odette sat in the interrogation room, still half asleep. Chase studied her file. Nurse, no previous convictions, divorced 2 years ago. "Ready to talk?" he asked as he entered the room. Odette nodded. "Tell me what happened tonight." "I killed them," she repeated. "David and Nancy." "Why?" Odette looked at him with empty eyes. "Because I couldn't live in a world where they were happy and I wasn't." Sunday morning at the Thornton Police Department began with an interrogation that would determine the fate of Odette Mitchell. Detective Chase Brown had spent a sleepless night studying the case files and preparing to talk to the woman who had destroyed her family in one night. In the interrogation room, Odette sat in orange prison garb, still in shock. Her court-appointed attorney, Robert Clark, sat next to her, periodically jotting something down in a notebook. "Miss Mitchell," Chase began, turning on the tape recorder, "last night you confessed to the murders of David Chen and Nancy Mitchell Chen. Do you confirm that confession?" Odette nodded. "Yes." "You need to say that out loud for the record." "Yes, I killed them." "Tell me in detail what happened last night." Odette slowly began her story. Her voice was monotonous, as if she were reading someone else's story. "Mom invited us to a family dinner. She said it was time to make up, but I knew there would be no reconciliation." She paused. "I brought a knife because I knew it could end badly." "So the murder was premeditated?" The lawyer placed his hand on his client's arm. "Odette, remember what we discussed?" "No," Odette said, pushing his hand away. "I want to tell the truth." She looked at Chase. "I didn't plan to kill them. I brought the knife to scare them, to make them understand that they had ruined my life." "But what changed?" "Nancy said she loved him." Odette's voice faltered, and I realized I'd lost her forever. Chase took notes, studying the woman's expression. In 20 years on the police force, he had learned to tell the difference between lies and the truth. Odette was telling the truth, no matter how terrible it was. "Tell me about your relationship with your sister." "Nancy was everything to me." Odette showed emotion for the first time, tears welling up in her eyes. "After my dad died, I became like a second mother to her. I protected her, took care of her. We weren't just sisters, we were best friends." "And when did that change?" "When she betrayed me." "Explain what you mean by betrayal." Odette wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her prison uniform. She was seeing my ex-husband. "Maybe not during our marriage, but..." "Detective, are you married?" "Yes." "Imagine your wife divorces you and then marries your brother a year later. How would you feel?" Chase understood the analogy, but he couldn't justify murder. "It would hurt, but I wouldn't kill them for that." "You don't understand. Nancy was the only person I trusted after my divorce, the only one who supported me. And then I found out she was seeing David." "When did you find out about their relationship?" "Nancy told me a month before their wedding. They had been dating for 4 months." Odette clenched her fists. "They lied to me for 4 months. For 4 months, I supported my sister through her difficult time, not knowing she was dating my ex-husband." The lawyer tried again to stop his client, but she continued. "You know what hurts the most? It's not that they were dating, it's that they were happy. David never looked at me the way he looked at her. In 5 years of marriage, he never smiled at me the way he smiled at her. Does that justify murder?" "Nothing justifies murder," Odette said quietly. "But you asked about motives. My motive is pain. The pain of not being wanted by anyone in this world." Chase studied the woman in front of him. A nurse who saved lives every day had turned into a murderer out of jealousy and feelings of abandonment. "Tell me about the detective agency. Why were you following David?" "I thought I'd find proof of his infidelity, that I'd show Nancy what he really was." Odette smiled bitterly, but the detective found nothing. David turned out to be the perfect husband, which only intensified my pain. Did the pain turn to rage? The pain turned to despair, and despair turned into what happened yesterday. The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Odette recounted every detail of the family conflict, her attempts to destroy her sister's marriage, and how she had reached the point of no return. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Chase met with District Attorney Jennifer Holmes to discuss the charges. "The suspect's statement is clear," Chase said. "A full confession, motive established, physical evidence consistent with her story." "Premeditation?" Holmes asked. "A difficult question. She brought the knife but claims she only intended to scare the victims. Second-degree murder? Possibly. Or first, considering she brought a weapon." Holmes nodded. "We'll prepare a first-degree murder charge. Double murder, premeditation is clear." The first court hearing took place on Tuesday. Odette appeared before Judge Michael Robertson, a veteran of the Adams County justice system. The courtroom was packed with journalists and onlookers. The story of a sister killing her sister and her husband had captured the attention of the entire state. "Odette Mitchell," the judge announced, "you are charged with the first-degree murder of David Chen and Nancy Mitchell Chen. How do you plead?" Odette stood up. "Guilty." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The lawyer tried to stop her, but it was too late. "Miss Mitchell," the judge said sternly, "do you understand the consequences of your statement?" "I do, Your Honor. I am not accepting this guilty plea today. I am giving you time to consult with your lawyer. The next hearing will be in a week." After the hearing, Chase met with Margaret Mitchell at her home. The woman had aged 10 years in 2 days. Neighbors were helping her with funeral arrangements, but the grief was inconsolable. "How could she do this?" Margaret asked over and over again. "How could my daughter kill her sister?" "Mrs. Mitchell, sometimes pain drives people to do unimaginable things. But Nancy was her everything. Odette protected her whole life." Chase sat in the same living room where the tragedy had occurred 2 days earlier. The bloodstains on the carpet had been cleaned up, but the atmosphere of death still hung in the air. "Tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, were there any signs that Odette was capable of violence?" Margaret shook her head. "Never. She was a nurse. She saved lives. Yes, she had a difficult personality, but murder?" She began to cry. "I lost both my daughters in one night." "What do you think about David and Nancy's marriage? Was it a betrayal of Odette?" Margaret was silent for a long time. "Maybe they could have done things differently. Waited longer, talked to Odette sooner. But love is love, and it doesn't ask for permission. Odette says she felt abandoned by her family." "We didn't abandon her," Margaret exclaimed. "I tried to keep the peace between my daughters. I constantly invited them to family dinners, hoping they would make up. But you took Nancy and David's side. I took the side of love against hate. Was that wrong?" A week later, the second hearing took place. This time, the lawyer convinced Odette to plead not guilty so that a full trial could be held to examine the circumstances of the case. But Odette was adamant in her desire to be punished. At a meeting with her lawyer, she said, "Mr. Clark, I killed 2 people I loved more than anything in the world. I don't want to escape responsibility. We can try to prove insanity. I was in my right mind, angry, desperate, but in my right mind. Murder in the heat of passion. That will reduce the sentence. What difference does it make? My life is over." The trial lasted a month. Witnesses testified about the family conflict, experts analyzed Odette's mental state, and she herself testified about her motives. In her closing statement, the prosecutor said, "Odette Mitchell committed cold-blooded murder out of jealousy. She couldn't accept her sister's happiness and decided to destroy it. This is not a crime of passion, it is a crime of selfishness." The defense attorney tried to portray Odette as a woman broken by grief. "My client has lost everything, her husband, her sister, her family. In a moment of despair, she made a terrible mistake. But it was the mistake of a broken person, not a cold-blooded killer." The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict, guilty of second-degree murder on 2 counts. When passing sentence, the judge said, "Odette Mitchell, you took the lives of 2 young people who had their whole lives ahead of them. Your pain does not justify your actions. I sentence you to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 25 years. Odette accepted the sentence without emotion. In her final statement, she said, "I want to ask my mother for forgiveness. I destroyed our family, and I want to tell David and Nancy, wherever they are, that I really loved them. I just couldn't let them go." The story of the Mitchell sisters served as a warning to the town of Thornton about how love can turn to hate and family ties can become deadly bonds. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented if pain had not overcome reason and jealousy had not overshadowed love.